Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the College of Forest Resources, I wish to welcome all of you to the Center for Urban Horticulture and to the 6th program in the Denman Forestry Issues series entitled Seeking Sustainability. Today's program is an outgrowth of considerable discussion at our college over the past several years as we have sought to define and articulate our strategic themes. The college is committed to provide world-class, internationally recognized knowledge and leadership for environmental and natural resource issues. Today, we look forward to an exciting and informative program that addresses many of these issues, and we have a panel of outstanding speakers who will address all aspects of this subject. The purpose of the Denman Forestry Issues series is to provide information and discussion on timely forestry and natural resource issues. As with all the activities associated with an academic setting, our ultimate goal is to inform and educate our students, faculty, and staff, as well as resource professionals, landowners, and the general public. These programs are made possible through the generous support provided by the Denman Endowment for Student Excellence. The mission of the College of Forest Resources is to study and investigate the sustainability and functionality of complex natural resource and environmental systems in both natural and managed environments using an interdisciplinary approach across multiple scales, which includes our urban and wildland landscapes. Sustainability is manifested through programs in sustainable forest, both managed and natural, to include commercial forest plantations, parks, reserves, and watersheds; sustainable urban environments, to include urban forestry, horticulture, restoration ecology, water and wildlife in public gardens, green belts, and open spaces; and sustainable forest enterprises, to include paper and sawmills, precision forestry technologies, tourism, recycling, nurseries, and non-timber forest products. Today, we focus on the topic of natural resource and environmental sustainability, seeking to obtain a better appreciation and understanding of the complex issues that such a concept engenders. Issues related to the economic dimensions of sustainability are foremost in the minds of many, especially public and private land managers, as they develop and implement new forest and land use practices motivated by new governmental regulations which have emerged over the past 30 years from changes in society that demand a more sustainable environment in order to protect the ecological character of our natural resources and environmental systems. Sustainability of our environmental and ecological services, as well as our natural resources, is only assured if the economic, ecological, and social metrics are kept in the proper balance, and all three must be considered simultaneously, as shown by the intersection of the three objects in this figure. How then is sustainability defined? It is a set of activities or processes that produce desired products and services over long periods of time. It is a rational approach that seeks a dynamic equilibrium among competing interests, and it is a process that uses an interdisciplinary set of social, ecological, and economic sciences in an integrated fashion to ensure that future generations have the same opportunity to enjoy the same products, services, and amenities produced by our urban and rural lands that we now enjoy. Our college is helping to address these new realities in many ways, one of which being today's discussion. This definition conveys the idea that sustainability applies to all resources, considers the needs of future generations as well as those of the present, is concerned with ecological functions and conditions, and is as much a social and economic as an ecological process. A commitment to resolving these issues is paramount, for we believe that the shift towards sustainable management and higher standards of urban and forest stewardship is irreversible and will grow stronger in future years. Several of our speakers today will be addressing the concept of sustainable forestry. A few of the key elements associated with sustainable forestry are the protection and enhancement of biodiversity, habitat protection and enhancement, riparian and wetland protection, maintenance of the productive capacity of forest lands, protection of endangered plants and animals, and protection of cultural, spiritual, and historic sites. Therefore, sustainable forestry is a land stewardship ethic that integrates practices associated with the growing and harvesting of trees for useful products while conserving soil, air, and water quality, fish and wildlife habitat and aesthetics, and protecting the resource from fire, pest, and diseases, and protecting lands of special significance. In short, sustainable forestry is managing a forest to meet all existing regulations such that environmental, social, and economic factors are balanced to meet the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. Okay, given all of that, how do we actually manage an urban or forest area so that it is sustainable? Well, that is the topic we are here to discuss today, seeking sustainability. Clearly, this is a difficult and complex undertaking because there are many stakeholders involved and each have their own set of goals and objectives. There are multiple and conflicting goals that each of these stakeholders brings to the table. This implies that trade-offs must be valued and factored into the decision-making process. And there is a large degree of uncertainty concerning future societal needs. What will future generations ask that we produce from our urban and our forested areas? There is uncertainty about the future state of the ecosystem and unknown environmental factors that will impact the state of those ecosystems. And there is a lack of complete understanding of ecosystem behavior and reactions of ecosystems to natural or man-caused perturbations. Nevertheless, there are a few things that we can do today that will contribute to our understanding of sustainability. We must recognize that the use of science is absolutely necessary, but is by no means a sufficient condition for finding the proper balance which we seek. We must recognize that value preferences expressed through the economic, political, and legal systems will largely determine the ultimate balance and solution. Recognizing this requires that we adopt an integrated, holistic, adaptive approach that considers all values simultaneously. Exactly how this is to be accomplished is still a debatable topic. We have some options. We can continue to use an adversarial process as we have in the past, as expressed in legislative environmental rules and regulations, or as expressed through our courts of law. Or we can adopt a science-based collaborative process conducted in a neutral environment, such as the University of Washington's proposed Northwest Environmental Forum, where we propose to use modern information sciences and decision support models to help resolve these difficult issues. Decision support models can be used in several ways. One is to find the best economic solutions to a particular problem, given a set of environmental regulations, habitat conservation requirements, ecological constraints, etc. Or we can flip that upside down and find the best ecological solutions given a set of economic sustainability requirements, habitat conservation needs, and so forth. Or a third option is that we can seek the best joint solution where economic and ecological values are involved in a socially determined optimum manner. The challenge is to actually define and implement sustainable practices, whether they be in urban or rural settings, is tremendous. It is a great challenge for educators, resource managers, scientists, and policymakers as we start this century. Now, to set the stage for our panel of speakers a little more concretely, I wish to turn to a different aspect of seeking sustainability, namely the context relative to our recent history of natural resource use here in North America during the past century. Natural resource managers, whether they be timber, fish, wildlife, have a long tradition based on the concepts of sustainable resource use, resource protection, and carrying capacity. Sustainable resource use, the first of these three, has largely been synonymous with maximum biological sustained yield. Few concepts have received more attention over the last 100 years in natural resource management than that of sustained yield, whether it be for timber, wildlife, or fisheries. The basic idea is that existing stocks of natural resources should be managed to guarantee that rates of replenishment, reproduction, restocking, and subsequent growth are in balance with rates of removal or harvest. Models largely constructed on the basis of biological productivity have been used to manage most of the world's renewable natural resources. The concepts of carrying capacity and resource protection, the other two concepts I mentioned a moment ago, are largely enabling agents for sustained yield. A century of economic research has failed to convince most natural resource managers to consider sustained economic efficiency on par with maximum biological productivity. Now, economic efficiency requires a well-defined property rights system to function properly. And for some natural resources, for example, fish and water, this does not normally occur. Instances of these common property or open access resources introduce complexities usually solved by regulation, but increasingly regulated by transferable quota rights or other forms of economic incentive. In many instances, externalities, whether they be positive or negative, and the notion of the public good complicate the management of natural resources which otherwise have established property rights. Traditional models of maximum biological yield, or sustained yield, possess no inherent measures of equity, either economically or socially. They are largely biological production models. Further, they provide no guidance during the transition stage when renewable resource stocks are built up or drawn down to sustainable levels. With the dismissal of economic efficiency as a guiding principle, sustainable stock levels are largely determined by the inherent physical carrying capacity of the land. In mixed capitalistic societies based on the notion of property rights and open markets, it is easy to understand why natural resource issues are so common and contentious. The traditional concepts, the first three that I mentioned, are too narrow and simplistic to serve as valid models for the future. Sustainable management of our natural resources. The third concept, multiple use, has historically been used as a policy instrument for rationalizing uses across the landscape. It is largely a normative and not a prescriptive approach. A weakness is that it is too closely identified with forest outputs instead of desired future states. Multiple use must be modified to meet the changing demands of society. A new paradigm that extends our traditional reliance on multiple outputs is needed, and sustainability offers this promise. The current use of the concept of sustainability is much broader than the twin concepts of sustainable resource use and multiple use. Sustainability, as we have seen, requires an explicit consideration of ecological, economic, and social factors not found in the above natural resource concepts. This brief historical review illustrates the new complexities sustainability attempts to explicitly consider. Our traditional models and management concepts worked well in the last century, but must be updated and/or replaced to serve the next century. This is the purpose of our program today. Speakers from government, higher education, and the private sector have joined with us, and each will discuss how their organization is interpreting sustainability, how they're implementing sustainable practices, and where the difficulties lie. I wish to thank all of today's speakers, as well as those who helped organize this event. I appreciate your contributions because I believe the future of forestry and natural resource management in Washington State lies in promoting the sustainable management of our state's natural resources. Thus, seeking sustainability is a task worthy of our in-depth discussion today. With these brief comments, I wish to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Hamish Kimmons. Dr. Kimmons was born in the Middle East and received his primary and secondary school education in England. He received a Bachelor of Science in Forestry from the University of Wales in 1964 and his Master of Science in Forest Entomology at the University of California at Berkeley in 1966. He was awarded a PhD in forest ecology from Yale University in 1970. Since 1969, he has held assistant, associate, and professor positions in forest ecology on the Faculty of Forestry at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. Dr. Kimmons has taught undergraduate forest ecology for 33 years. He is presently the Canada Research Chair in Forest Ecosystem Modeling, which models the sustainability of forest ecosystems. He is a member of UNESCO World Commission on the Ethics of Science and Technology. He authored the book Forest Ecology, the standard text for forest ecology, and the very popular book Balancing Act, Environmental Issues in Forestry. Dr. Kimmons is the creator of the Forecast family of hybrid simulation ecosystem management models. His topic today is sustainability in the face of change. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hamish Kimmons.
I'm a forest ecologist, but forestry is not fundamentally about ecology. It's not fundamentally about biodiversity, although, as I hope I shall persuade you, those are extremely important foundations for sustainability in forestry. Forestry is about people. Forestry is defined as the art, the science, the practice, and the business of managing forested landscapes to sustain the diversity of values desired by people. And as people change the balance of values they want from forested landscapes, by definition, forestry must also change, as indeed it has changed in the past. So the prime directive of forestry is to change as society changes its balance of values. However, the second responsibility of forestry is to resist change, which in the experience and knowledge of foresters and other individuals are inconsistent with the ecology and the sociology of the new desired balance of values. So while forestry is about people and people's values, unless it is based on a sound biophysical foundation that respects the way nature works and the way ecosystems function, it is very unlikely that we will fulfill our ethical obligations to future generations to pass on to them the values that we think they will want. And hence, my talk is going to primarily focus on biophysical things. Now, as Pogo said, I've been out and I've seen the enemy, and it's us. The ultimate problem is people. In the time I've been associated with forestry, the world's population has more than doubled, and I'm not that old. In the time of my grandson's life, it will increase again by 3 to 5 billion people. This means that we must change the historical relationship between humans and forests, if indeed we are going to sustain the full balance of values desired by people. We simply have to change the way we do things. And there's another problem, not only the numbers of people, but in 1955, 32% of the world's population lived in cities. By 2025, it's predicted to be 60%. And as we move from the countryside to the cities, we lose touch with the reality. Where does milk come from? Safeway. Where does wood come from? Home Depot. No, it comes from farms and forests. But as we increasingly urbanize, we lose touch with reality, and we run the risk of failing to respect nature as it is and try to manage it as we wish it would be. And that may not give us sustainability. In Cairo today, there are 19 million people in the city by day, 17 million by night, 2 million commute every day. In Shanghai, 17 million people. This is enormously worrying because these people are living in an environment that is divorced from nature. It's divorced from the reality of where our resources come from and the reality of how do we sustain the multiple values that we want for ourselves and to pass on to future generations. In China, for example, we see a landscape, one part of a 20 million hectare section of one province, which has been rendered into this condition by 50 years of foreign occupancy, civil war, and totalitarian government that was completely divorced from the reality of ecosystems and biophysical sustainability, totally focused on people and politics. It doesn't work. You've got to found sustainability on a respect for nature. That was government. You go to Brazil, you go to other parts of the world, Uganda, and simply people raising their families, trying to feed their children, have wrought an enormous deforestation on landscapes of unimaginable size, losing many of the values that used to exist in those landscapes. Now, one of the great leaders of thinking in forestry, of course, was Aldo Leopold, a forester, a farmer, a fisherman, a hunter, but above all, a conservationist. And he said in The Land Ethic, a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. Unfortunately, this has been taken to mean by many people that if something changes, if it loses a part, it no longer has integrity, the Swiss watch analogy of the ecosystem. If it changes, it must not be stable. And in fact, if it's not beautiful, if it does not please our aesthetic sensibilities, it must be environmentally wrong. But read on. On the very next page of the Land Ethic, Leopold says, the evolution of a land ethic is an intellectual as well as emotional activity. Process. Conservation is paved with good intentions which prove to be futile or even dangerous because they are devoid of a critical understanding either of the land or of economic land use. He squarely put people and ecology as the two key elements that were fundamental to achieving sustainability. And I think Aldo Leopold was right. So my talk is sustainability in the face of change. And I'm going to suggest a concept called ecological rotations and some of the kinds of tools that are needed to evaluate ecological rotations as a way of evaluating the biophysical foundations for sustaining the values that people want. So I'll start off with what does sustainability mean, an illustrated essay, and then I'll talk about respect for nature, what this constitutes, and then finish up with this evaluation of the tools. Now, what on earth does sustainability mean in forests and landscapes that are continually changing naturally? Naturally here without people, but of course people are natural, but using the vernacular that in fact many people feel were unnatural, which as an ecologist I cannot agree with. Here is a damaged ecosystem, a 500 to 800-year-old stand of Douglas fir on Vancouver Island, which was the subject in 1997 to an extremely strong wind event, and about a third of the trees were knocked down. Now, the overstory of this forest, the trees that were knocked over, were Douglas fir. But there was no Douglas fir regeneration in this forest. There were no Douglas firs, only hemlocks and a few western red cedars. So the sustainability of this stand is absolutely dependent over timescales of many hundreds of years on this kind of disturbance. This is not unsustainable. In fact, disturbance of this type is essential for the long-term sustainability of the giant overstory Douglas fir trees, without which they would be replaced by western hemlock, a completely different aesthetic kind of forest. Here is the north end of Vancouver Island, where in one night in 1906, 30,000 hectares of the native unmanaged forest were blown down to create these dark-colored forest patches that are growing at subtropical plantation rates, up to 25 cubic meters per hectare per year in unmanaged stands. The pale yellow, pale green areas growing at about 1 cubic meter per hectare per year did not suffer damage. Clearly, the entire productivity, the biological productivity, the carbon sequestration, the creation of wood volume and various kinds of habitat are linked to periodic disturbance of this sort, which does not come every 60 or 80 years. Sometimes it may go 200 or 300 years, but nevertheless, disturbance is part of the long-term stability and productivity of that landscape. Fire, of course, is a very frequent element in our Pacific Northwest forests and in many parts of Canada. And whilst it looks catastrophic in the short term, it turns out that the balance of nature, if such a thing exists, that is the relationships between insects and forests, diseases and forests, and ensuring that over time we have a wide diversity of tree species and forest types in the forest, those values are dependent on periodic stand-level disturbance of this type. Here is a landslide in an unroaded wilderness area, unmanaged, unroaded, the result of extremely high winds and heavy rain events which are so typical in November, and we've just experienced one in the last few days. This looks very catastrophic, but over timescales of hundreds of years, this landslide, now occupied by red alder, this will be the most productive part of the landscape. Within 150 years, the most productive and the most biologically diverse for many of the biodiversity measures, not all, but many of the measures of biodiversity will be highest in this disturbed area. But you might say, landslides like this do a lot of damage to streams and to salmon habitat, and indeed they do. They create a lot of siltation and damming and disruption of habitat. But if you have 23 inches of rain in a weekend in this mountainous habitat, the water velocity is such that there is a steady depletion of salmon spawning gravel. The gravel is continually being washed out to sea. And if you did not have such events over a 1,000-year period, there would be little gravel for the salmon to spawn in. So what looks like a damaging event in the short run, and indeed is damaging of certain values, in the long run is part of the stability of those values. Bark beetle outbreaks. Mountain pine beetle killing lodgepole pine in southeastern British Columbia. At the moment, we have a 6.2 million hectare outbreak of mountain pine beetle, completely natural, as a result probably of fire, well, not completely natural perhaps, because it reflects fire control policy that has created a lot of very old lodgepole pine forest, but something which clearly has happened in the past many times in the absence of forest management and fire control. So this is a natural event that ensures future supplies of lodgepole pine, western larch, and many of the early cereal shade-intolerant hardwood species which are so important for biological diversity and visual diversity, and aesthetics, and many other human values. So all of that is part of stability. So how can we define stability? Well, it is not constancy. It is non-declining patterns of change. Stability in forest ecosystems is continuing disturbance at various frequencies and severities, and as long as the combination of severity and frequency is in balance with the recovery of the ecosystem, then we have a non-declining pattern of change. And I would suggest to you that that is what we mean by ecological sustainability. If we change any one of the frequency or the severity of disturbance or the rate of recovery, then what is a non-declining pattern of change becomes declining. And in this example, we have increased the frequency, we have shortened the rotation, in this case of a harvest, and what was a sustainable level of disturbance is now non-sustainable. And this is going to lead into this concept of ecological rotations. So we look at a clear cut. Everybody loves to hate clear cuts. I don't, as an ecologist. Clear-cutting ecosystems is an entirely appropriate way of harvesting some ecosystems for some values at some times. But I'll come back to that. So here's a clear cut in central British Columbia, and the tree species regeneration in that stand is exactly the same as in the surrounding, even-aged, natural fire origin stand. So clearly, in terms of the tree species which will create the forest habitat, that is sustainable as long as the rotation length is not too short. So what about ecological rotations? What is this concept I'm suggesting could be useful in trying to evaluate sustainability? Well, not all ecosystems are the same. Some ecosystems, when you disturb them, recover very quickly. Some recover more slowly, and some are extremely delayed in their recovery. So an ecological rotation is the time it takes for a particular ecological condition or a particular value to recover from a particular severity of disturbance in a particular kind of ecosystem. So if we can understand what controls the rates of ecosystem recovery, if we can deal with the frequency of disturbance, then we can start balancing these three things: severity and extent, severity, frequency, and rate of recovery, to produce non-declining patterns of change, and then we have sustainability. But what values? When we start thinking about sustainability, we find that the definition is very different according to the particular values we're talking about, the spatial scale over which we wish these values to be sustained, and the time scales we're prepared to consider. If you only own a 100-acre woodlot, and you want sustainability of a lot of aesthetic and biophysical values, you are not going to create a 100-acre clear-cut, because in your life you will lose many of those values. No, at that spatial scale, small-scale forestry is the appropriate way of sustaining the values. But if you're managing a 1 million or 5 million acre forest estate, then clear-cuts, sometimes of 100 acres or more, may be the correct scale on a rotation that is long enough to give recovery of all the values you want. But not everywhere. You shouldn't do anything everywhere. We'll come back to that. So if we're talking about moose, moose like a lot of early cereal habitat. They like fire areas, they like clear cuts, because there's a lot of the herbs and the shrubs that they depend on. But they don't want all young, they want some old, mature forest to shelter in the winter, to shelter and escape predators, etc., etc. It's a question of balance. Bears. Well, if there aren't enough caves or other shelters in a deep snowpack area, bears need somewhere to hibernate in the winter. And so this old western red cedar tree with a nice hollowed out base makes a perfect little bear den, and it takes about 300 years for a tree to reach that stage. So the sustainability of that bear habitat is completely different from the sustainability of the moose habitat. We have to respect the biology and ecology of each of the individual species, each value, if we're going to get it right. If we want to maintain the character of Canada's great boreal forest, much of which has been burned over at frequencies of 40 to 50 years. If we want to maintain the mixed wood character, we want to have fires of sometimes 1 million hectares, but many small fires as well, not all big fires, at a frequency and severity that in fact maintains what has been, as far as we know, thousands of years of mixed wood boreal condition. If, on the other hand, we want the aesthetics, the spiritual value, the wonderful feeling that it gives you to walk through a forest like this by yourself, put it in a park and protect it. These values are sustainable on very, very long timescales. To create these 300-year-old trees and the snags and the decay and the coarse-wooded debris, that is something that is renewed on a very long timescale and is an important value for people. And biodiversity, it has important biodiversity connections as well. And therefore, we need to set aside sufficient areas like this on very long scales of natural disturbance, take away the human disturbance, in order to sustain that kind of value for us and future generations. But let's go to the other end of the spectrum. We all like wood. We all use wood. Wood provides jobs. It contributes to our economy, particularly in British Columbia. It's a major part of our economy. So we want to sustain the productivity. Here is this wind-thrown northern community on Vancouver Island growing at 25 cubic meters per hectare per year, a wall of wood. You can't even see through these forests. And these are extraordinarily productive. In comparison, 50 meters away, part of the stand which didn't blow down, it's growing at about 1 cubic meter per hectare per year. Both valid ecological conditions, both natural ecological conditions, but if you're wanting to maintain jobs, rural communities, supply of logs to the mill, the previous slide is a better condition to sustain than this one. And of course, we want it all. Here is on a Gulf island in the Straits of Georgia, the kind of partial harvesting that looks beautiful and is appropriate for the cottage community that lives there. I am lucky to have a cottage there. And this is the kind of forestry that's very nice to look at. But the great ecologist, Vladimir Krajina, warned 50 years ago, do not do this. Because you have an understory of shade-tolerant hemlock and cedar, which can tolerate the 10 and 15-year droughts that these islands experience if they are in the shade of the Douglas fir overstory. And if you high-grade it, if you do this beautiful-looking aesthetic forestry, that's what happens the next time the drought comes along. Nature corrects our mistake. So sometimes beauty is not a good guide to ecophysiology, ecology, and sustainability. And so we have to really look at how those systems are working right down to the ecophysiology and the microclimatic relationships of individual species to decide what level of stand disturbance is appropriate to sustain the values. And of course, all we have to do is ask our First Nations people. What they did was underburn for 6,000 years on these islands to create a shelter wood of Douglas fir, eliminated the shade-tolerant understory, and that created this Douglas fir forest. We should do that, but we can't because we have cottages there, including mine. So the question then is, how are we going to do it? And of course, we have disease relationships. Western hemlock dwarf mistletoe, wonderful aesthetics and biodiversity implications, but we do not want all of our forests to look like this, all of our hemlock forest. And it is natural disturbance, not genetic resistance. It is natural disturbance that plays a major role in controlling this disease organism. So if you take disturbance out of this so it looks beautiful, you are going to create future hemlock forests that look like this. And I don't think that's what you want. It's not unnatural, because this occurs naturally, but it does not occur naturally over large areas. Why? Because natural disturbance in the past has eliminated it and maintained that balance. And so we need to emulate that. So we must base our relationships on a respect for nature. That is the only thing that, as an ecologist, that I can see as our way forward to achieve our ethical obligations with respect to sustainability. So go to your dictionary and you'll find two kinds of definitions. The first set of definitions include to revere, to esteem, and to be deferential towards the object of respect. You're walking through a European cathedral, you're walking through the Louvre looking at the ancient artworks, you're deferential towards it. You want to protect it and look after it. But the second group of definitions is different. It says to notice with attention and to pay due regard to. I respect you by learning your name, your likes, your dislikes, your family history, and I relate to you based upon that understanding. The first is an emotional, from the heart, qualitative definition. And folks, we are an emotional, qualitative species. We make the big decisions in our life from our heart and through our eyes. We fall in love, we choose a house, we buy a car, as much on initially visual information and from our hearts as from our head. So to say that's an emotional argument and dismiss it is nonsense. That denies humanity. We are an emotional species, so these values are important. But if we only deal with emotional values, And if we pretend if something looks bad, it's environmentally bad, whereas in fact it is not, in fact it's an appropriate level of ecological disturbance, then we are failing to go on to the second definition, and that is, as Aldo Leopold warned us, to be devoid of a critical understanding of land does not give you a land ethic. So we must respect nature as it is, not as we want it to be. The first thing we must do is respect ecological diversity. Everybody goes to biodiversity, but as an ecologist I say, whoa, let's deal with ecological diversity first. That is the ecological stage that defines which ecological play and which ecological actors can be there. The ecological play is the disturbance and recovery sequences in ecosystems which define all the different species, the actors that can appear in the different acts of the play. But we start off with the stage because that defines what you can have. Sorry, we can't grow banana fruit in British Columbia. You have to go to Hawaii for that. We don't have the right ecological stage for bananas. You go to the tropics. So the ecological stage, the climate, the soil, the topography, the natural disturbance regimes define what is biologically possible. Within that, by varying the kind of disturbance you apply and the frequency and severity, you can define which actors are going to appear in which order on that stage, and that's our biological values. So here in British Columbia, we have many different ecological stages as a function of climate, enormously climatically variable, as is indeed Washington is, and we have a lot of different geologies. And within this ecological diversity, every one of these traditional silvicultural systems, modified indeed for the new values, modified with variable retention, with structural retention, all the good things that we didn't used to think about. Why didn't we think about those? Because people didn't want them. Now we know they're important. People want them, and so they're part of forestry today. Responding to people. But all of those things, from clear cutting, which is the correct ecological disturbance in some of our ecosystems at a certain frequency and in a certain way, all the way to individual tree selection in those ecosystems where clear cutting would be entirely wrong. The tragedy is today that people are trying to get rid of these greater disturbances, looking at the past where they've been applied everywhere, which is entirely wrong, and wanting to replace that error with soft touch ecoforestry everywhere. It's the same mistake. It's failing to respect nature's diversity that says we must do different things at different times in different places to sustain different values. That's what respect for nature means for me as an ecologist. But of course, we do need to respect biological and temporal diversity. The modern concern about biological diversity came from deforestation in the tropics, a major, major concern, but it was transferred uncritically to northern ecosystems where we do have biodiversity concerns. Indeed we do, but they are somewhat different. We have to learn that we can't take an experience over here and apply it over there uncritically, unaltered. That's what Leopold was talking about. A lack of understanding of the land and of economic land use. So we have all these different measures of biological diversity, and they all change over time, and there are three different spatial, there's alpha, beta, gamma, three different spatial scales, and they all change over time. So what does a forester do when she or he is told to protect biodiversity? My advice is sit down and have a cup of coffee. Wait until you're told what levels of which measures at which spatial scales, with what pattern of change over time society wants, then you get up and you go and do it. And you have an obligation to do that for society. But until you know all those things, you literally don't know what to do. And so we want to have temporal diversity. We don't want to fix this sequence at any one stage, industrial forestry plantations or old growth or farmers' fields over here. We don't want to fix it there. We want to have all of it, because then we get all of the values, all of the biodiversity. And we want to try to emulate nature. We want to look at what natural disturbance has done. Landslides, wildfire, insects, wind, and diseases. What have they done to ecosystems to create the values we inherited from the past? Let's now try to do in our forestry something that creates the same processes, the structures, the visuals, and everything, trying to emulate nature. Not slavishly, because it includes burning my cottage down on Denman Island, but enough that we can emulate the natural processes fairly well. So, we need a new relationship. We need a new forestry. And there are many different paradigms or approaches we could base this on. We could have ecosystem management, adaptive management, zonation, variable retention, emulation of natural disturbance. There's lots of different ways we could approach it. But there's one thing common to all of these, and that is they all require forecasting tools. We want to know what will happen in the future if we do this, and what will happen in the future if we do that. Because thinking about the results in the future for our grandchildren and their grandchildren is part of the ethics of deciding what we do today, not just the values we want for ourselves today. And so there's all sorts of tools. These are just some, not necessarily the best, but we need tools that deal with individual trees, individual ecosystem elements, and the fingerprint. Each tree has a fingerprint on the soil, and that's very important. It creates soil variability. We need stand-level models that tell us a whole bunch of values, economic, social, and biophysical, that come from a stand. We need complex cut block models that we currently lack. We don't know exactly what all the long-term implications of variable retention, complex cut block type of harvesting is, so we need these kinds of models. We need the tools developed here in Washington, Bob McGaughey's excellent stand-level visualization system, because we have to communicate these model outputs to people, and people are visual and from the heart. So we use Bob McGaughey's excellent SVS. And there's, for example, a comparison with two strategies for retention within a block, different visuals and different biological meanings. And the thing that looks nicest may not be best for the wildlife. So we have, again, to balance that off. We want tools for education and scenario analysis for public involvement, watershed models where we can apply different strategies of management at the stand and watershed level and have a look at all the values. We need larger landscape level models. And we need to tie them all together into meta models, not mega models, they get too big, but meta models, where you're tying these individual models together into complex assemblages linked to visualization. Here's a 20,000 hectare visualization we did in southeastern British Columbia, looking at two different scenarios of forestry and the kind of age class sequences, and then interpretations for different wildlife species. So, and then you make a movie. These are just two frames out of a movie, and you show the movie. The brilliance of Hollywood, you know, movies. People like movies. So you need to take these models and make movies because people relate to that. People relate to the visual evidence as well as the quantitative elements. So finally, to conclude, forestry has always been the result of unregulated exploitation that has resulted in the loss of values. The first stage of forestry is always a set of rigid regulations, administrative forestry, that fails to reflect the diversity and the functioning of nature. That doesn't work either. That doesn't sustain all the values. And so we go on to ecologically based forestry, which is rules and regulations and guidelines based upon an understanding, as Aldo Leopold suggested, an understanding of the way nature works. And ultimately, we go through to ensure that that ecologically based forestry provides for all the social values that people want. Unfortunately, as we go through this process, the public sees the unacceptable consequences of the past paradigms, clear cutting everywhere, for example, and they put social pressure to change forestry, but often that involves more rigid regulation. Ban clear cutting, do soft touch forestry everywhere, same error. And you swing back from this logical advance towards social forestry, and you swing back to administrative forestry. And so if we are going to be really successful in getting sustainable forestry, we have to ensure that we go down that vertical development and we resist the kinds of things Aldo Leopold warned us about that would divert us and in fact take us back. So the conclusions. Nothing is as constant as change. Nothing is permanent. Sustainability means non-declining patterns of change, not constancy. Doesn't exist in nature. The concept of sustainability is relative to desired future values, and it varies according to different values and time and spatial scales. Assessing sustainability in the face of change requires use of ecosystem management models because we don't have the 100-year experience of new ways of doing things. So we have to make forecasts. And finally, the concept of ecological rotations may help us work out what is ethical forestry and what will create a balance between what we want today and what we want for our grandchildren. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kimmons, for that very interesting and informative discussion on sustainable forestry. Now we're going to make a transition from more of the philosophical and general introduction that our first two talks concentrated on to looking at how certain agencies and organizations are actually practicing sustainability. We've listened now to two opening introductory talks and have a good idea of how sustainability is defined and how the general underlying premises are supposed to work. I think we now recognize the large element of complexity of the task that lies before us, and we are now prepared to move from the general to the more specific practical interpretations and illustrations. Designing, understanding, and managing natural resource systems on a sustainable basis over an entire life cycle is a major challenge facing society. I wish to thank you for joining us today for this edition of the Denman Forestry Issues series on Seeking Sustainability. For more information on this and other forestry topics, please send us an email to cfruw@u.washington.edu. Thank you.